Welcome back. In this module, we're going to look at troubleshooting for Exchange 2016 client access services. In this module, we're going to discuss some troubleshooting fundamentals, troubleshooting tools that are useful, as well as how you can use log files for your troubleshooting scenarios. To kick things off, let's just go over some troubleshooting fundamentals that are really important to understand whenever you're tackling a client access problem. The first is understanding end-to-end connectivity. There is not a straight line between your client and the Exchange server. Your client will be connecting through a network. That network may have multiple routers, switches, firewalls, load balancers, WAN optimizers, and other appliances between the client and the server. And it's really important to understand that those devices exist and that they could all be influencing the connectivity of your clients to your Exchange servers. Build a picture in your mind, or even draw one on a piece of paper, of how the client that is experiencing the problem and your Exchange server connect to each other and everything in between, and that's going to help you a lot. And in particular, it's going to help you with isolating problems. It's really important to isolate problems so that you can quickly eliminate potential causes. The faster you can isolate a problem, the faster you can narrow in on a smaller number of possible causes, and you can start doing some testing of potential solutions. Make good use of available tools and logs. There are a good set of tools and log files on your servers as well as on your clients that can help you in troubleshooting scenarios. And it's not just the client and the server. Once again, you do have all of those other network devices, firewalls, routers, WAN optimizers, load balancers, potentially in between your client and the server. So the logs on those devices can be just as useful. Now, one tip I will give you about logs is that they can not only record possible signs of a problem, but they can also reveal the absence of something. So if you're looking at your firewall logs and you're not seeing any errors, does that mean that the firewall is not causing a connectivity problem between your client and the server? Or does that mean that the client is not even reaching the firewall at all because some other problem, such as a DNS problem or a network problem further along the line, is actually preventing them from even reaching that firewall in the first place? So don't just use your log data as evidence of a problem. You can also use it to narrow down your focus for where the problem might actually be. And finally, make sure you test one solution at a time. If you're having client connectivity issues and you reboot a server and change a certificate and also change something on your load balancer all at the same time, and then the problem goes away, well, which one of those solutions actually fixed it? You really won't know. So just take your time, test one solution at a time, and that way you can be sure that you found the actual cause of the problem. So here's an example of a troubleshooting scenario. Let's say you've got reports that an external mobile device user is having problems connecting to their mailbox. Well, there's a lot of potential causes. There's their internet connection, there's the public DNS resolution for auto discover and also for your client access namespaces. They need to connect through your firewall, potentially through a load balancer, before they'll actually reach one of your Exchange servers or whichever server is hosting their mailbox at the time. Well, here's how you could narrow down that issue. Are internal users having the same problem? If you find that internal users are not having the same problem, well, then it's probably less likely to be a load balancer issue or a server issue, and you should start your investigation outside, looking at the firewall and perhaps the public DNS. As another example, let's say you have multiple external users and multiple internal users. And some of your external users are fine and some of your internal users are fine as well. But one particular user is having problems connecting both internally and externally. Well, that again eliminates several possibilities. If multiple external users are able to connect to Exchange, then it's likely that DNS and firewalls and load balancers and even the servers themselves are healthy. And similarly, if internal clients are able to connect, then the same is probably true of the load balancer and the servers. But if you have that one particular user who's having some issues both internally and externally, well, maybe the problem is isolated just to that user, and you should start looking at mailbox-specific causes of those problems. And here's some of the problems that you might encounter for client access through your troubleshooting and investigation of issues that users are experiencing. DNS records can cause problems with clients who are then unable to locate an auto-discover service, and they may be also unable to connect to the client access namespaces. So if they can't resolve them in DNS, then obviously they're going to have problems locating and connecting to those services. If one or more of your client access namespaces is behaving erratically, it could be that client traffic is not load balancing correctly, or perhaps services are not behaving as highly available. So your load balancer might be sending some client traffic to an unhealthy protocol or service on one of your member servers. If you have a problem with your SSL certificates, and these are quite common, it's very common in fact in the real world to find misconfigured certificates, your clients will begin displaying certificate warnings or security warnings, or in some cases they will just outright refuse to connect. If you have clients who are getting repeat or unexpected authentication prompts, well, that could be incorrect or inconsistent authentication settings across the different client access services. For example, if you have two different Exchange servers with different Outlook on the web authentication settings, then you might have Outlook on the web users seeing unexpected authentication prompts as they get load balanced between different Exchange servers. Authentication prompts would also be caused if an account is locked out or if an account becomes expired. So it's not always an Exchange issue, it could actually be an Active Directory issue with that user's account being locked or expired. When out of office settings won't apply, this is a classic issue, and it is almost a sure sign that Exchange web services is either unreachable, so the namespace that is configured on the Exchange web services virtual directories can't be resolved or connected to, or perhaps there is an SSL problem preventing that connection, or perhaps the Exchange web services protocols are just unhealthy on one or more of your servers. And similarly, if you have offline address book download errors in Outlook, those errors are being reported when Outlook does a send receive, or the users are reporting that they're not seeing the latest updates of the offline address book. Again, the classic causes of those issues are unreachable namespaces for the offline address book virtual directory, or being unable to connect due to SSL errors or other errors, or perhaps the OAB virtual directory has become unhealthy for some reason. When you're troubleshooting client access services, you can make use of several useful tools. So these tools should be a regular part of your toolkit, and you'll find they help you identify and resolve issues much faster when you use them. First of all, the basic DNS tools of NSLookup, or if you prefer PowerShell, you can use resolve DNS name. Performing DNS lookups of your client access namespaces should always be one of the first things you do when you're troubleshooting client access connectivity issues. Just always make sure that those DNS records are present and that they're resolving to the IP addresses that you expect them to. You can also use other network tools like ping, or again for PowerShell, test connectivity, and traceroute or test net connection. Now, pings don't always work. It could be that pings are not allowed or are being dropped by a firewall on the server or a network firewall. And the same goes for traceroute. But it's useful to do those ping and traceroute tests anyway, because even when DNS lookups are working, you might find that a host file entry on a client is actually causing the client to try and connect to a different IP address than what's in DNS. And ping and traceroute can help you to identify that situation. Outlook has the built-in test email auto configuration utility, which runs through a complete auto discover test, and then will return all of the different URLs for different services that Outlook will be trying to connect to. And Microsoft also provides the Remote Connectivity Analyzer tool, which is a web-hosted tool or a cloud-hosted tool that you can use to test external access to your Exchange server. And we're going to look at the working of that tool in just a moment. LogParser Studio is another great tool from Microsoft. LogParser is a tool that can be used to quickly analyze text-based log files such as IIS log files. But it can be a little tricky to learn how to use LogParser, which is why Microsoft came out with LogParser Studio, which provides a graphical front end and a whole bunch of pre-canned reports. So in effect, when you run LogParser Studio, you just point it at your log folders and you can basically make use of those pre-canned reports to pull some interesting statistics. For example, you could pull HTTP error statistics from your IIS logs. And finally, the Office Configuration Analyzer tool, which is run on client machines, and it will analyze the Office client configuration and look for common causes of issues such as auto-discover problems, misconfigured registry items, and other issues that might cause clients to not connect. Well, let's go into the Globomantics environment and look at one of those useful tools, which is the Outlook Test Email Auto Configuration. With Outlook open, we can hold the left control key and right click on the Outlook icon in the system tray, and we get this Test Email Auto Configuration option. You do need to provide the user password. Just remove the two Guest Smart options and use Auto Discover and start the test. In a healthy environment, this test only takes a few moments, but it may take a little bit longer if any of the auto discover operations are timing out. So that can be a clue that there may be a problem with auto discover in the environment. There's two ways you can look at this information. One is to look at the raw XML that auto discover provided, and the other is to look at the results, which are just a little bit more readable. And from here, you can see which namespaces, which URLs are being returned by the Auto Discover service to the client, and also other information returned by Auto Discover, such as whether SSL is required for a service and which authentication type is being used for a service. Things that you can look out for in these results are URLs that are incorrect. Perhaps they've been misspelled, or they have a HTTP prefix instead of a HTTPS prefix. Exchange, of course, requires SSL by default, so if you're missing the HTTPS prefix, then the client is going to be connecting on the wrong port or protocol for that service. When you're looking at this information, if you're absolutely sure that your servers are configured correctly, but you're still seeing the wrong results from Auto Discover, it could be an Auto Discover failure, or it could just be some Auto Discover caching. So you may simply need to recycle the Auto Discover app pools in IIS on your Exchange servers to clear that cache, so that Auto Discover starts delivering the correct information to the client. And in this log view, you can also look at how Auto Discover was found in the environment. So in this particular example, the Auto Discover URL was found through the service connection point, and that's the service connection point that's configured by using set client access service. And the connection to that URL was successful, and that's where Auto Discover was retrieved from. If the SCP wasn't working or the client was external, then you might see other URLs attempted there as well. And if Auto Discover fails completely, well, you'll see those log entries in this view also. Next, let's take a look at the Microsoft Remote Connectivity Analyzer. You can access the Remote Connectivity Analyzer by going to exrca.com, which will redirect you to the correct URL of testconnectivity.microsoft.com. And the Remote Connectivity Analyzer gives you a good number of tests that can be performed for client access. Now, the real strength of the Remote Connectivity Analyzer is that it is an external test of your environment. Without this tool, if you wanted to test ActiveSync connectivity or Outlook connectivity from outside of your network, you would need to have a mobile device or a laptop that is maybe connected to an internet connection and manually perform those tests. Now, that may not seem too daunting, but when you're performing your own tests with Outlook or with a mobile device, you don't get the level of detail that the Remote Connectivity Analyzer provides. And I'll give you a demonstration of that now. Let's perform the Exchange ActiveSync test. The Remote Connectivity Analyzer does use real credentials to perform the test, so you need to provide an email address as well as a username and a valid password. If you have any concerns about providing the password to this Microsoft tool, then you can create perhaps a temporary account to perform the testing and then delete or disable the account when you're finished. Or if you need to use a real account because you are testing a specific account in your environment, well, then you can always just reset the password afterwards. If you know that you have a problem with your SSL certificate and you still want to perform other testing of your ActiveSync connectivity, then you can ignore Trust for SSL. But if you think you do have the correct SSL certificates and you're trying to do a complete end-to-end test, well, then you can just leave that blank and then go ahead. And of course, there is a CAPTCHA that needs to be filled out. And once you've verified that, your session is verified for about 30 minutes. All right, just click perform the test and then wait a few moments for that test to be completed. This test has failed, which is great because it gives us a chance to dive into why it might have failed. Now, if you were performing this testing from an actual mobile device, a failed connection would come up with a fairly generic error. You wouldn't know exactly which part of the end-to-end connectivity from that mobile device to your Exchange server had actually failed. But with the remote connectivity analyzer, we can expand the steps that were performed, and we can see that, for example, auto discover was successful. And we can even drill down further into auto discover and find out which auto discover method was successful. You can see that the client first attempted the root domain lookup, which failed. So then it continued on to the auto discover CNAME lookup, which was successful. Auto discover returned the correct URL, mail.globomantics.biz, and that was validated successfully. It was able to be resolved in DNS. The remote connectivity analyzer was able to connect on port 443 to that host, which tells us that the firewall was open and it was at least natting the connection to something that was listening on port 443. The SSL certificate was found to be valid. And that has a little warning indicator on it, which we might find out some more information about. And yeah, in this case, the warning is just that some Windows mobile devices might have trouble with that certificate. So that's good information to know as well. The authentication method was found to be all expected, no disallowed methods. The method that was found was basic. So that's the default and that's the normal authentication for ActiveSync clients. And then we see the error actually occurred after that step when the ActiveSync session was being attempted with the server. And it's here in this folder sync command that the error occurred, and we have an IIS response that is a HTTP 403 forbidden response that's come from that server. So knowing that the problem is most likely authentication, perhaps the password or a locked account, that's where you can focus your troubleshooting, which saves you a lot of time that you would have otherwise spent looking at firewalls and certificates and other things in that end-to-end client connectivity. Well, no discussion of troubleshooting would be complete without a look at log files. And when you're dealing with Exchange Server, there are a few sources of those log files that you can use for your troubleshooting scenarios. There are, of course, the Windows event logs. For client access issues, always take a look in the event logs and just look for any particular events around the same time as your client issues, or that may be related. For example, if you're looking for offline address book issues, the event logs will often have events logged for those problems. Since most of the client connectivity, especially the HTTPS services, connects to an IIS instance on the Exchange server, well, the IIS logs will be very useful as well. And there are also the POP and IMAP protocol logs. Log files can be useful for your troubleshooting in a few different ways. First, the obvious thing, they can indicate whether or not a client's connection is actually reaching the server. If you cannot find any log file entries in IIS for a particular client's connection, well, then it's likely that the connection never made it that far, and you can start working your way back through the end-to-end connectivity and look at things like load balancers or firewalls or DNS. Just keep in mind that if you're using multiple Exchange servers and you're load balancing, then the log file entries for that client's connectivity could be on any of those servers, and you'll need to look on multiple servers as part of your investigation. The IIS log files record HTTP status and error codes, which are also useful. A HTTP status code of 200 is good, that means it's okay. 401 typically means unauthorized, or any of the other 40X numbers typically means some sort of authentication problem. And the 503 code means service unavailable, and there's also other 50X codes that typically indicate a server problem rather than a user problem. You can use IIS log file analysis to indicate whether your load balancing is working. So this is more of a statistical analysis, looking at the volume or the number of connections that each Exchange server is handling and letting you know whether your load balancer is accurately distributing that traffic across the servers. You might find that one of the servers is in fact being overloaded by too many connections, and that's why clients who are connecting to that server are having some performance issues. To do that type of analysis, you might require some extra tools. I've already mentioned Log Parser Studio, which can help you with that, or you can just use the plain Log Parser tool. And there's a big market of third-party log aggregation and analysis tools out there that can help you with that task. Well, let's go into the Globomantics environment and take a look at the IIS log files on the Exchange servers. The IIS log files can be found on the Exchange server in their default path, which is on the C drive in the inet pub folder. We've got a log subfolder and then another log files subfolder, and you'll find one log files folder for each of the websites that IIS hosts. An Exchange server has two websites, the front end and the back end website. For client access issues, you'll typically start looking at the front end website. And you can just sort these files by their date modified timestamp to see the most recent files at the top. They are just text files. You can open them in Notepad, but as you can see, there's quite a lot of information there to try and digest. Now, this is a structured file. There are fields along the top that you can use to identify what a particular part of a log file entry means. You can expect these files to be quite busy because at all times Exchange is doing synthetic probes of client access services to make sure that everything is healthy. It's all part of the managed availability framework within Exchange. And you'll also have health probes from your load balancer as well. So you'll see quite a lot of log entries here generated by the system and not necessarily generated by users, even in a very quiet environment. For that reason, it can be useful to perform some keyword searches to try and narrow in on the particular log entries you're interested in. We've found here a line in the log file that is a connection from Adam Wally. And just scrolling across, we can see that that is an active sync connection coming from a user agent from testexchangeconnectivity.com. So clearly that is one of the tests that we looked at earlier from the remote connectivity analyzer. And in this case, there was some HTTP status codes of 401, which probably align with that error or that failed test that we saw in the remote connectivity analyzer. So keep in mind that you're only looking at the log file of one particular server here, and if you're load balancing, you'd need to look at the log files across multiple servers. And as a structured text file, you can look at these log files in Microsoft Excel to just make them a little bit more readable. So just jumping onto a client machine where Excel is installed, I've already imported this data into Excel, and you can see that it already makes a lot more sense. We clearly have a date and a time column. There are source IP addresses visible. We can see which URL or virtual directory was being requested. So there we can see requests to auto-discover and to the active sync virtual directories. Further across, we can see the server port that was being connected to. So there's some connections on port 80 for PowerShell and some connections to port 443 from Adam Wally during that active sync connectivity test. And then again, those server status codes are visible there as well, some 500s, 401s, 200s. And you can use Excel pivot tables to create aggregate reports and do analysis of the data if you don't have any other third-party tools available, or just use Excel to make the log files a little bit more readable during your troubleshooting. Next, let's take a look at configuring the POP and IMAP protocol logs. POP and IMAP are separate client access services that do not use IIS, and so they do not use the IIS log files for logging client traffic. We can take a look at the POP log settings for a server by running the get pop settings commandlet. There is a default log file location located in the C program files directory. That's where the logs will be stored. And protocol logging is not enabled by default. And by default, the log file will roll over on a daily basis. Now, one thing I will point out here is that there is no log file retention or log file automatic cleanup settings for POP and IMAP protocol logging. So while these log files are very useful for troubleshooting purposes, if you turn on protocol logging, those log files will just continue to accumulate, and eventually you run the risk of filling up your C drive, which will of course cause problems with the server. So if you do plan to use protocol logging, you either need to just turn it on and off as needed for troubleshooting, or implement some form of log cleanup script of your own that will remove the files automatically after a certain amount of time. Enabling protocol logging is as simple as running the set pop settings commandlet. We can configure one server at a time. And in order for that change to take effect, the POP3 services need to be restarted. You can see those services by looking for services matching the word POP. As you can see, there are 2 of those. So just restart each of those services. And the same configuration can be applied to IMAP as well. So it is just get IMAP settings instead of get POP settings. And it is just set IMAP settings instead of set POP settings. So the 2 commandlets work almost identically, just different commandlet names. And as with the POP settings, those IMAP services also need to be restarted. So after the restart, those log files will begin accumulating. They are structured text files, much like the IIS log files. You can analyze them with the same tools: Log Parser Studio, Log Parser, PowerShell, or Excel, or your own third-party log aggregation and analysis tools. So in this module, we looked at some troubleshooting fundamentals and also some of the tools that you can use, such as the Remote Connectivity Analyzer, to help you with your client access troubleshooting. And we also took a brief look at the log files that you'll find on Exchange servers in IIS, and also protocol logging for POP and IMAP. Coming up in the next module, we're going to take a look at address books.